Okay, so we're here at Tofino School Garden, and we're doing a little pruning session. So the first thing we need is we need some tools. So I really like to get good quality pruners because it takes a lot of energy to make these things, and so if you get a good quality one like these Felcos, they have a spring. I mean, there's other brands that do this too, but these particular ones, watch for a replaceable spring and watch for a replaceable blade, because then you can have these for the rest of your life. And you know, if you damage the blade, you can replace it. If the spring will get old, and then you can replace it. There's a couple of different types of pruners, and they're based on the way the blades actually go towards each other and pass each other. These are called bypass pruners, and so the blade goes by the other. The other type of pruner that's available is called an anvil pruner, and the anvil pruner, the blade comes down on this flat surface. So these ones are good for removing dead wood and things that you don't care if they live, but they do tend to crush the stem. They're very powerful, so they're good to remove scrub brush or things that you don't want to grow. But if you're doing some fine fruit tree pruning or something, or nice shrub pruning, these will really crush the stem. And if the stem is crushed, the cut isn't very clean. If the cut isn't very clean, then there's more surface area for bacteria and disease organisms to colonize. So you want to make a nice clean cut. And the bypass pruners will do that, whether they're long handled or short handled, as long as the blade goes by the other. Speaking of a clean cut, it's really important to keep your tools sharp and to sharpen them on the regular basis. Like on a regular day when I'm pruning, I might sharpen these 2 or 3 times just to touch them up, to keep them moving smoothly, so that you're making smooth cuts, to make it easy on your hand so that your hand doesn't get worn out, and it's more ergonomically correct to work with sharp tools. So what you want to do is take something like this. This is a diamond hook sharpener, and it's got a diamond surface, it's got a flat surface, and these are pretty easy to find online or at any of your tool places. And you want to put the flat part of this on a 45-degree angle, move it a bunch of times in one direction until you will see an edge actually coming up on it. The metal will get shiny, and you'll see some of the burrs kind of smoothing out. And then after you've done that for a while, you just turn on the back side, and then put your sharpener flat and drag it a couple times over, really nice and flat, to take off any edge that you've created with your 45-degree angle. The other tool that's really important for bigger branches is a good saw. And a saw that's curved like this actually works better on tree trimming than a straight saw. The other thing is that I love the Japanese saws. They cut on a pull movement, and so especially if you're up in a tree, the gravity works with you to pull, and so that's really makes it easier. The steel is very good in the Japanese saws, and you know, although other companies make good saws, there's a lot of Japanese companies that make saws too. It's not one particular brand, but it seems that the Japanese style of saw will tend to have a better metal content in it, and also just the fact that it's on a pull motion makes it, I find, much easier to use. And also nice to have these little holsters and scabbards, because then you don't lose your tools, especially if you're spending a lot of money on them, and you've got them right where you need them when you go to prune. When you look at a tree like this, you know, the big question is, what do I do next? You know, people will walk up to a tree because they've heard that you need to prune your fruit trees, and that might or might not be true. So It's always good to take a moment and to just really look at your tree. Good to know what kind of tree it is, how it responds to pruning. But the most important thing is to ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? And there are better or not so good reasons to prune a tree. The best reason to prune a tree is to protect the health of a tree, because you have a pretty big investment in a tree, in money, in time, in garden space. And orchardists prune a little bit differently because their whole system and their whole techniques are different. They replace their trees more often, which the average homeowner doesn't want to do. They might use more sprays. And most fruit is actually not grown organically, unfortunately, so they might use more sprays to compensate for it. But when you're doing your own backyard tree, first and foremost, if you want to preserve the tree, should be your goal should be to preserve the health of the tree. The second good reason is to keep the tree from being damaged. So if you have a tree that is, say, a pathway maybe where people are going by isn't so bad, but if you had a tree where the branches were hanging over, where a truck might go through and actually break the branch off, you're better off to actually prune that branch off so that it's a controlled cut rather than having it randomly break when this truck goes by and breaks it. So in some cases, foot traffic also, if it's an eye poker, you're better off, the person who knows what they're doing, is better off pruning it so that someone just doesn't snap it off midway. The other thing is to, part of the health of the tree is to maintain some sort of good shape for the tree. And most trees will actually do this on their own. So really a minimum of pruning is your best pruning. If a tree has never been pruned, it will probably grow into a beautiful tree. Unfortunately, what happens is sometimes we as humans want different things from our trees, like fruit trees. We want to get maximum amount of fruit from them. And so sometimes we do slightly sacrifice the health of the tree in order to achieve something like more fruit. So no pruning is always best. You'll probably, if the soil is good, a tree is kept well watered, you have good pollination, which is difficult in really rainy areas. But if you have all the conditions that are good, you probably won't have to prune a tree and you'll still get some fruit from it. If the tree is growing in a less than optimum condition, which many of our trees are, then it's going to probably need some pruning. For one, a tree's top will mimic its roots. So if there is, say, some place that the roots can't grow in one direction, that part of the tree might become stunted, so it will throw it off balance so that the other part of the tree gets overwhelmed and then the tree is unbalanced. The other thing that can happen is that quite often trees are just sort of topped at the nursery right away, and so once they're topped, once they're pruned, they always have to be pruned. So if you have a tree that's ever been pruned before, you will have to continue to prune it. The other thing that's for your fruit production is you want these branches to be spaced out enough that all the branches get a certain amount of light. And sometimes some of these things can be accomplished instead of pruning with a certain amount of training. Think bonsais that used to wrap copper wire along a branch to shape it a certain way. But you don't have to get that fancy, and if you do wrap them too much, you have to watch that the bark doesn't wear. But a simple weight will keep this branch down low where it would have gone up high. Lots of people want to prune a tree to keep it short to pick the fruit better. that is really not a great reason to prune your trees. You're better off, if you can, to choose trees that are already dwarf or semi-dwarf so that they stay low just by the effect that the rootstock has on the top of the tree. If you're inheriting a tree that already is a big tree, I personally recommend getting either a fruit picker on the end of a long pole or getting a tall orchard ladder and just leave the tree alone without topping it. Topping it always results in a slow death of the tree. Saying that, lots of trees have been topped, and I have seen trees that look to me like they should be dead, and they're still producing lots of fruit. So there's hardly ever a lost cause. Once in a while you'll see it, but hardly ever. The other thing, when we talked about pruning to prevent damage to a tree, if you have a situation where these branches start to rub on one another, and here's a great example, if you can get in here to see where this branch, this one branch, was rubbing on this branch here. And you can see how it just wore off the bark. And so it's just like, the bark is just like our skin, where if the skin is intact, we're less likely to get an infection. If the skin is broken, we're more likely to get an infection. And it's the same with trees. Disease organisms can very easily colonize that nice juicy area right underneath the bark that's got lots of water and lots of nutrients. And so that's where disease organisms can get established. So you want to prune the tree to prevent the rubbing of these two branches. So along with that goes anything that's already headed in the wrong direction. So you might have a branch that's not rubbing yet, but the sooner you get it, the younger it is when you remove it, the less stress it is on the tree. And we all know stress, whether it's an animal, vegetable, or human, stress will be a problem. So we don't want to stress the tree more than we have to. So the sooner we can remove a small branch that might end up being in trouble, the better off we are. As far as removing where to remove, you can always remove something dead. There's a branch collar located on every branch attachment. So the other thing to take into consideration is where to remove the branch. And I see a lot of situations where, say this branch is growing into this pathway, people come and they just shorten it. They just chop it off right here. Well, sometimes that's done and sometimes people get away with it, but some of the rationale to not do it is that this bud and all this branch over here will continue to bring water and nutrients up the stem. If we cut it here, the plant, there's nothing else beyond it to bring those water and nutrients and waxes that the plant needs to seal this wound, to compartmentalize this damage. There's nothing to draw them up as dramatically as if there's a branch at the end. So anytime we shorten a branch, anytime we top a tree, we're interrupting that flow of nutrients that should be coming up to heal this wound. And so it might still be okay, but it certainly isn't optimal. And we'd like to do optimal practices. The branch collar is the wrinkly tissue that is where a branch is attached. When we cut, and some branch collars are easier to see than others, but it's generally this wrinkly tissue right here. We don't want to cut into the xylem, which transports water and nutrients, in the main stem, but if we were removing this branch, we would cut on the outside of the branch collar, making sure that we didn't go into the branch collar. One problem that you see in fruit trees, especially that have been pruned a lot, are suckers. And this one isn't too bad for suckers. But what a sucker is that you'll have a branch coming out horizontally, and then because the tree, it usually happens when the tree has been pruned too dramatically, or if the tree has been, the tips have been removed, where one of these buds will just send a shoot straight up off of the horizontal branch. So you have a mostly horizontal branch here. If I cut it back, this would probably shoot up, so would this one, so would this one, and we'd have a group of these suckers. Because when you remove the tip is producing hormones that's keeping all of these little buds dormant. The minute we remove the tip, all these buds can be activated, and so they just send up growth, crazy upright growth that is very unlikely to have fruit. So the rule of thumb is not to remove more than a third of the growth of the tree every year. And pruning is not a one-step process. No matter what you cut, the tree will try to restore its root to shoot ratio. So it's going to put out new growth to replace whatever you've cut off, and it's your job to come back afterwards and to see where that new growth is going and to remove any new growth that's growing in the wrong direction as soon as possible. So, as I mentioned before, pruning is always a two-step process, at least a two-step process. So, and that ties in with the timing of pruning. So we're standing here in almost the middle of February. Beautiful day, middle of February. For the middle of February, they're not all like this in the middle of February, but this is the time of year you want to do any major pruning, because what will happen is this tree is still dormant. It's got little buds, but they haven't really started opening yet, and so this tree is still relatively dormant, but it's very close to coming out of dormancy. Now, the sooner this tree comes out of dormancy, the sooner it can heal any damage that we're doing by pruning. When the tree is completely dormant, it's not transporting the waxes that it needs to compartmentalize any damage that we do. And just cutting is the damage. It has to seal that wound. A tree will develop 4 different walls to seal around the area where you've cut. And to do that, it has to be actively manufacturing carbohydrates, which means it's got to have leaves, to really pump enough carbohydrates to concentrate into the waxes that will actually seal off and compartmentalize any damage. So major limbs get removed this time of the year because we're just getting into the part of the year where the tree will become active. It's going to unfold these beautiful young green leaves that are very efficient at photosynthesizing. So it's going to be making a lot of food once these leaves open, and it's going to be taking up a lot of water because we still have, in the spring, we still have a lot of water being delivered. So the tree, hopefully it has good soil, it'll have enough water. It's coming out of dormancy, so it's really pumping. The new leaves are young and vital and really efficient at producing things, and so it can very easily produce those waxes that it needs to seal it up. If we cut earlier in the winter, and many orchards for years did this because, well, for one, they had so many trees. If they didn't start early, they wouldn't finish in time, because ideally you want to finish before the buds open or else the tree bleeds too much. So they would cut early and, again, sometimes use fungicide to counteract the problem that's created by leaving an open wound all winter unhealed. So they would cut and then they would fungicide. So we don't really want to do that. We don't really want to encourage any spraying. So the ideal time to do this is right before the tree comes out of dormancy. that limits the amount of time that that wound is going to stay open. And that's just like with a human, you want that wound closed as soon as possible. And so that's the first step, is to do the major pruning. You can tell if a branch is alive or not by scratching the bark, and if it's got a little bit of green underneath it, it's still alive. Remember, don't remove more than a third of the live growth. It doesn't matter about the dead growth, you don't have to count that. But then after you do the major pruning and the tree is coming out of dormancy and the tree is replacing its root to shoot ratio, that's when you come back and you look and you see, oh, this bud here has come out of dormancy now, and it's compensating for what I removed someplace, and it's growing like this one into the middle. Well, having something in the middle like this has got a few different problems. For one, it's not going to take long before it's tangled with the other things. For two, once this gets leaves, it's going to shade the whole inside, so if there's any fruit, the fruit on the outside will ripen just fine because it has a lot. But if there's any fruit on the inside, it won't ripen as well because this will be shading it. Three, it's going to bump into something. And four, to even get up into a tree, to prune it, to check what's going on, to harvest the fruit, it's going to get in the way. So we want to remove something like that. Now this is already older, but if we had pruned this tree this time of the year, came back later in summer, and saw this little twig growing into the center, basically it's headed for trouble. And so we want to cut it as soon as possible so that it doesn't head into trouble, because the sooner you cut it and the smaller it is when you cut it, the less stressful it will be for the tree. So the other thing I get asked a lot is about the health of the tree and how to care for your fruit tree. Of course, the first thing is to select a good, healthy tree. So some trees you'll find have very narrow branch attachments when you look at them in the nursery when you're shopping for them. And those can actually create problems in the future, because both of the trunks in a narrow double leader will continue to expand. Pressure can build up and split the tree. So choose a good tree. Tell them not to prune it for you in the nursery when you buy it, that you'll prune it at home. And it will, by not pruning it right away, it will delay a little bit of the fruit crop, but the tree itself will form a nicer, more natural shape and be less susceptible to problems and having to dramatically keep pruning it in the future. You'll have a little bit of pruning always maybe, but not as much. The other thing is the soil. If your soil is too wet, the fruit tree roots can rot. You'll see many fruit trees that are leaning way over because they're planted in too wet soil and their roots have rotted. Now, I've seen lots of fruit trees continue to produce in those conditions, but if you really want a healthy, happy, beautiful tree, if you can possibly plant it in an area that is not quite as wet of soil, your tree will be much happier. The other thing is the soil around the tree, and when you plant your tree, if you have a pot that's 10 inches wide, dig a hole that's 30 inches wide. Take all the soil off, mix it with compost and good soil, then put it all back in. So you're digging a much bigger hole than the pot. Never just dig a hole the same size as the pot and then put the fruit tree in, because that soil that's in the pot is probably quite a bit different in its texture and its infiltration rate, and you could run into a situation where water is either pooling around the roots of the tree or not ever entering the root ball, depending on the differences in the structure of the soil. So dig a big hole, plant the tree in there, mix the soil that you got out of the hole with the compost, with the soil that came off the root ball of the tree that you've purchased. And I always recommend to use some mycorrhizae inoculant on the roots of the soil, on the roots of the tree, because that will help the tree access water and nutrients for the rest of its life. It establishes a relationship with the mycorrhizae, and it will help feed the tree. They form a symbiotic relationship that's good for both of them for the life of the tree. The other thing is make sure that the soil is rich in compost. You can top dress with compost, you can top dress with seaweed, lots of minerals in seaweed. And if I personally don't like spraying even dormant oil if I don't have to. I like to choose resistant varieties of trees. There are some fruit trees that are more disease resistant than others, and those are always a good choice. And then the other thing is to make sure that your tree is just really well fed, because stress will cause disease. If your tree gets some kind of disease, and some trees will, no matter how well they're fed, because they're not happy in the environment that you've put them in, they haven't been genetically adapted to certain environments like super wet environments or super dry environments, and some trees need a certain amount of cold even. And so sometimes trees will get sick because we're trying to grow trees in a place where the basic environment is not ideal for them. Then I don't usually use dormant oil if I can avoid it. If you have a bad insect problem or a bad disease problem, you might want to lime sulfur, you might want to spray with dormant oil, but I find that I've never had to. One of the sprays that I have used, though, is this compost tea spray. So we're talking about aerated compost tea. We're talking about tea that's made from a diversity of materials. And you can even, there are some designer compost teas that are designed for certain diseases by actually using some of the disease material in the compost itself. And what this does, and I know this is contrary to a lot of what we've learned, but what this does is it ends up feeding the organisms that will eat the disease. So inside your compost, there are organisms that eat all kinds of disease. In your compost, they will grow and multiply and thrive. When you make compost tea and spray it on your tree, then it inoculates your tree with those organisms, and they will continue to stay on your tree and help your tree.